All right, this lecture is going to be on the history of ethics. We're going to look at the pinnacle of ethical thought, which is the ancient Greeks, primarily Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint screen, and I'm going to share that with you. And this is the lecture that we did earlier today in class, which did not record. So I'm re-recording it for you. And so there we have it. Ethics, history of ethics. Now then, let me fix that. All right, history of ethics. So history of ethics, we talked about Socrates, and the thing that I want you to be aware of with regard to Socrates is that Socrates was primarily concerned with man, humanity. Specifically, Socrates was concerned with virtue. Virtue means really essentially what kind of person am I to be. Socrates was concerned with living the good life and what is a good person. For Socrates, a good person was a virtuous person. A virtuous person was a person of character and integrity. So Socrates begins with the idea of humanity living the ethical life, individuals living the ethical life. The second thing you should know about Socrates is prior to Socrates, the philosophers were concerned with metaphysics or the nature of ultimate reality. But that was not a priority for Socrates. Socrates was concerned only with virtue, only with ethics, and how can one live the good life. That's the primary emphasis for Socrates. On this particular slide, you'll note that Socrates never wrote anything, the last two bullet points, and also that we are familiar with the teachings of Socrates primarily through the writings of Plato. The writings of Plato are called the dialogues. The earliest dialogues are the dialogues that are most reflective of Socratic teachings. So they are most reflective of Socratic teachings because they are the first writings that Plato penned after the death of Socrates. So they're closer to Socrates in proximity of time. The middle dialogues and the later dialogues written by Plato are not regarded as reflecting Socrates' teachings. Only the early dialogues reflect Socratic teachings. And again, Socrates never wrote anything. So the only way we really know about Socrates' teachings are through essentially the writing of Plato's. There is Plato. There are some other sources, but Plato's writings are the primary source. All right, so then I'm going to skip those questions. Then we move to Plato. The thing that I want you to know about Plato is, and I would write this down, Plato is concerned with the ethical life as the life of duty to a moral code. Plato was concerned with the ethical life as fulfilling one's duty to a moral code. The illustrations we've gone over in class are a moral code such as a religious moral code that reflected in for example, the Ten Commandments. Plato was concerned with duty to a moral code, and it made no difference with regard to what the nature of the code was. It could be a religious moral code, such as the Ten Commandments. It could be a civil code, such as the law of the land, speed limits, those kinds of things. Or it could be an internal moral compass, like one's conscience. Plato thought that there was placed within each individual a sense of right and wrong that functioned as a moral code to guide one in making moral decisions. So in that sense, and this is an important word, Plato was reflects the beginning of non-consequentialism. Plato was not concerned with the consequences or the outcome or the results of our moral decisions. He was only concerned with our answering or obeying the moral code of the land or the religious moral code, or primarily the code of one's conscience. It's kind of an inner sense of right and wrong. We do the right thing, Plato says, regardless of the consequences. The right thing is the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not the consequences are good or bad. So Plato is a non-consequentialist. duty to a moral code, religious code, civil code, the law of the land, or an internal moral compass, for example, your conscience. So then after that, we consider the third pinnacle, third person who represents the high point of ethical thought, and that is Aristotle. Now, this slide is wrong because it says the greatest influence upon Western ethical thought was Aristotle. I disagree with that. I mistyped that. It should say that he was not the primarily the primary influencer of moral thought in the Western world is thought to be Plato, not Aristotle. Now, Plato taught Aristotle, and so Aristotle, however, differed from Plato. Plato was a non-consequentialist with regard to moral decision making, but Aristotle was a consequentialist with regard to moral thinking. In other words, Aristotle was concerned with the consequences of our moral decisions. And he said that we should make moral decisions based upon the possible outcomes, the possible potential consequences or results of those decisions. Why? Because Aristotle was convinced that those consequences have an impact upon our character and upon our person and upon our identity and shape the kind of people that we are. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the theory of virtue ethics. So Aristotle was a consequentialist. The illustrations that we went over in class with regard to Aristotle being a consequentialist, remember those. They will help you remember what Aristotle taught. For example, Aristotle taught that, for example, if I am late for class and I'm tempted to speed, then I should make the decision that will produce the best consequences. What does that mean? Well, if I make the decision to speed on the way to class and violate the law of the land, and I get to class on time, then Aristotle would essentially say that was a good decision. On the other hand, if I speed and I get a ticket, Aristotle would say that was a bad moral decision. So basically, he says we look at the moral decisions that we're making, and we look at the possible consequences of those moral decisions, and we choose the one with the best consequences, or the best outcome, or the best results. So Socrates was primarily concerned with being a virtuous person. Plato was primarily concerned with having a duty to obey a moral code. That could be a religious code, that could be a law of the land, or that could be a conscience, one's conscience. Aristotle was a consequentialist. Aristotle thought that we make moral decisions based upon the consequences of the decisions that we're making. So those three individuals represent the high point in Greek ethical thought: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so they provide really the foundation for the theories that we're going to look at in the next block of material for the next, after we finish a couple of other movements. So I'm going to look at this. And so that brings us to Epicureanism, and that's where we got to in class today. And we will pick up with Epicureanism in the next lecture. Those are the high points. Those should help you significantly with regard to the exam coming up in about a week and a half. Have a great day.